Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson, and today I'm taking on as my topic the most famous work of the writer who is often described as having largely inspired the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason, along with its various byproducts, such as the ideals of civil liberty, which subsequently inspired both the American and the French revolutions. This was, of course, François-Marie Arouet, the youngest child within a low-ranking French noble family and author of 10 plays, 2,000 pamphlets and books, and over 20,000 letters, who is more generally known by the primary of his over 178 pseudonyms, Voltaire. The specific text I'll be talking about, which was greatly popularized in late 20th century culture by Leonard Bernstein, Lillian Hellman, and former United States Poet Laureate Richard Wilbur's musical theater adaptation, is Candide. But first, a clarification. The statement that is most commonly attributed to Monsieur Voltaire, "I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," is not something that he ever specifically said. Rather, this well-known assertion appears to have been derived from a 1906 biography of the 18th century French intellectual that was written by Evelyn Beatrice Hall in an effort to convey an encapsulation of her subject's beliefs. That said, the topic of freedom of speech was clearly of extreme importance to Voltaire, having twice been sentenced to France's notorious prison, the Bastille, as a result of opinions which he had expressed, as well as having been physically assaulted in the streets of Paris, in addition to being forced into hiding and exile a number of times in order to avoid potential prosecution or possibly persecution for his opinions prior to his publication of Candide in 1759 at the age of 65. It was following a first prison term confined in a windowless cell for 11 months, when the writer was only 24 years old, that he adopted the name of Voltaire, as explained at the time in a letter to philosopher and social contract author Jean-Jacques Rousseau, because the ex-con had been unhappy under the name of Arouet. He'd also presumably been unhappy when a love affair he'd had with a young woman in Holland while serving as the page of a French ambassador had been broken up, and he'd been forced to return to Paris just before being sent to prison. Then, about 9 years following his release from the Bastille, having become a playwright and poet, as well as surviving smallpox, when once again faced with prison after having challenged a nobleman to a duel, Voltaire chose exile in Britain over a second turn in the Bastille, and spent the next 2 years in England meeting with such people as Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. Also, some 30 years following the establishment of a constitutional monarchy and the passage of a Religious Toleration Act in an attempt to resolve over 150 years of conflict, Voltaire was impressed with England's relative freedom of speech and religion in comparison to the absolutism dominating French society under the Sun King Louis XIV and his heirs. Returning once again to Paris, Voltaire joined a group of investors in a government lottery and won a small fortune, which, when combined with money inherited from his family, made him a very wealthy man indeed. But then, 8 years later, he published a book of philosophical essays praising England's constitutional monarchy, which was immediately banned and burned in public, forcing its author to quickly leave the French capital. For the next 16 years, Voltaire lived with a married mother of two who was a dozen years younger than himself, the extremely accomplished intellectual Emily Marquise de Châtelet, in her husband's chateau near the border of the districts of Champagne and Lorraine. Together, they collected a library of over 20,000 volumes, Voltaire paying all the bills, as well as for extensive renovations to the chateau, with his lover's husband frequently coming to visit. Following extensive correspondence and even traveling to meet Frederick the Great of Prussia, Voltaire eventually left the Marquise, subsequently returning to Paris and establishing a close personal relationship with a niece, Marie-Louise, his sister's daughter, who is 18 years younger than her mother's brother. Marquise du Châtelet, of course, also moved on, beginning a new relationship which, sadly, soon led to her death following the birth of a fourth child. A bit later, Voltaire was invited to accept an official position in Prussia. However, after a time, he once again encountered difficulties regarding the expression of his opinions, although maintaining a correspondence with King Frederick after returning to France. Banned from Paris by Louis XV, Monsieur Voltaire bought an estate near Geneva, Switzerland, but as a free-thinking deist who believed science is real and whose repeated opinion regarding organized religion was encaisser l'enfant, crush the infamous thing, in about 3 years he moved from the Calvinist country, which since 1506 has supplied mercenary guards for the Vatican and the Pope in Rome, to a new estate on the French side of the border. There, Uncle Francois Marie lived with his niece, entertained guests ranging from the happily married John Adams to Giacomo Casanova, established a number of local industries, created a large and highly productive farm, declined an invitation from Catherine of Great to come to Russia, and completed the manuscript for his novel Candide before eventually being invited back to Paris, where, a month after joining with such individuals as George Washington, Thomas Paine, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, by becoming a Freemason, largely due to the encouragement of Benjamin Franklin, Voltaire died in 1778, 2 years after the American Revolution and 11 years before the rebellion in France seeking liberté, égalité, fraternité, and beginning with the July 14th storming of the Bastille. Now, for anyone who might be wondering what all this biographical information, adolescent romance interrupted, a year in the Bastille, time in the military state of Prussia, exile, great financial windfalls, the death of former lovers, international travel, and the careful nurturing of the land, has to do with anything, an answer should soon present itself. But first, a slight digression. The German mathematician and philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, aside from inventing calculus and the notion of kinetic energy, had reasoned that God, as an all-powerful, all-knowing, and fully beneficent being had, by intelligent design, created the best of all possible worlds, given that, in his divine wisdom, he could have created any kind of world, but chose to make the one which exists as it is, including free will and what human beings often consider to be evil, or, at the very least, things which the one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity, Isaiah 45:7, has allowed to pass it, human understanding. This, in Voltaire's mind, at any rate, to say the very least, was apparently perceived to be, in more or less contemporary colloquial terms, a crock. And it is the case against Leibniz's notion of sufficient reason, which, fairly or not, is presented in Candide. To summarize the book broadly, in the Westphalia, northwest German province castle of Baron Thunder ten Tronich, an innocent young boy named Candide, who is suspected of being the illegitimate son of the Baron's sister, had been raised along with the Baron's son and 17-year-old daughter, Cunegunda, who had become attracted to her possible young cousin. A tutor within the household, named Dr. Pangloss, taught his students, and anyone who would listen, metaphysical theological cosmology centered around the belief that human beings live in the best of all possible worlds. One day, however, Cunegunda, to borrow a phrase from the Led Zeppelin song Stairway to Heaven, noticed a bustle in the hedgerow, and she witnessed Dr. Pangloss engaged in an intimate embrace with a chambermaid from the castle, Parquet. And this gave her the idea of dropping her handkerchief as an overture to Candide, which, when responded to as she had hoped, immediately led to their discovery and the young man's eviction from the Baron's home. Candide is then impressed into the Prussian-like Bulgar army, flogged and sent into battle, but deserts and goes to Holland, where he meets an Anabaptist named Jacques and happens to encounter a beggar who turns out to be Dr. Pangloss, suffering from a bad case of syphilis, which he had contracted from Parquet. Candide then learns that the Bulgar army had attacked the castle, killing the Baron and his 360-pound wife, as well as presumably the rest of the household, Cunegunda having, within the process, repeatedly been raped. Jacques, however, is able to cure the good doctor, although he loses an eye and an ear during the process. Together, the three of them journey to Lisbon, but during a storm at sea, Jacques drowns while saving the life of a sailor. Dr. Pangloss explaining that the body of water had been created by God in order for Jacques to drown within it, just as an earthquake and tidal wave strike the Portuguese capital, killing several thousand people, the surviving sailor quickly going off to become a looter within the devastated city, while an injured Candide is lectured about the positive aspects of the disaster. Dr. Pangloss quickly comes to the attention of the Portuguese Inquisition, and both he and Candide, it is decided, should be tortured and executed as heretics to please God. While the professor is in the process of being hung, however, there is an aftershock, which allows his young student to escape. assisted by an old woman, Candide is brought to a house where he is shocked to discover Cunegonde, who explains that, surviving her gang rape by the soldiers who'd killed her parents, she'd been sold as a sex worker to a Jewish merchant who, to avoid anti-Semitic persecution, had begun sharing her with the Grand Inquisitor. When these two abusers come to the home of the old woman, who, as it happens, is the daughter of Pope Urban X, who had been captured by pirates and, during a famine, had one of her buttocks cut off to provide food before becoming the servant of the Jewish merchant and meeting Cunegonde, Candide kills both of the sexual predators before he and the two women flee to the Americas. In Buenos Aires, the region's governor seeks to marry Cunegonde, and a Spanish commander tries to arrest Candide for having killed the Grand Inquisitor, but he escapes with a servant. Traveling to Paraguay, they are confronted by another commander who, as it happens, turns out to be the surviving brother of Cunegonde. But when Candide expresses a desire to marry the nobleman's sister, the man assaults him and is presumably killed in self-defense. Fleeing once again, after mistakenly shooting some monkeys, which, as it turns out, may have been the cross-species lovers of the women Candide had thought they'd been attacking, he and his travel companion are captured by a group of noble Incas, ultimately arriving in the land of El Dorado, where the streets are paved with gold, although eventually leaving with hundreds of treasure-laden pack sheep. With his servant being sent to get Cunegonde, Candide returns to Europe, but his riches-carrying sheep are stolen. Obtaining a new servant, a man named Martin, and then traveling to Venice, they meet a group of dethroned kings who have come to attend the city's carnival, encounter the chambermaid who had given Dr. Pangloss syphilis, now working as a Venetian prostitute, and discover that the servant sent to get Cunegonde has become enslaved within that same exotic Italian city. He then tells Candide that his beloved, having become extremely ugly from her various hardships, along with an aged female companion, is serving as a charwoman for a Transylvanian nobleman. Traveling to secure her freedom, Dr. Pangloss and Candide's brother each have miraculously survived and are found to be serving as galley slaves. Candide's former teacher still insisting that Leibniz could not be wrong regarding God's creation of the best of all possible worlds. Cunegonde and the old woman are then liberated. Candide marries his hideously transformed beloved, acquires a small farm, and, after conversing with a whirling dervish and then a Turkish subsistence farmer, informs Pangloss and all of the others that, circumstances being what they are, regardless of how they may have come to be, in all practical terms, we must cultivate our garden. Now, consensus regarding the meaning and significance of this work is, of course, non-existent. But then, too, the same can be said for an understanding of the meaning of life itself. Intelligent design, Big Bang or oscillating universe theory, natural disasters or acts of God, military and religious conflict, global warming, social justice, It's all a lot to think about. Perhaps Voltaire's Candide got it right. One planet with a finite amount of consumable resources. Sustainability is a pretty good goal, given the circumstances, however they may have come into existence, and with whatever reason or total absurd lack of purpose they may have. It seems that the best course of action could very well be to accept the inconvenient truth that it is what it is, and once all is said and done, that we must, in fact, cultivate our garden. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.